Hi, everyone. Today we're talking about the greatest military general in history. Now, who was it? There's plenty of people who'll give you plenty of names, and we're going to talk about them. We'll go through all of them, and we'll sift through them, and we'll get to the top three, top five, top three, and then who I think is the number one greatest military general of all time. It's not an easy one. There's no easy answers to this one, so stick around because this is worth listening to. Now, of course, we're going throughout history. So anyone from military generals, say from the Second World War backwards. So no one after the Second World War, I'm afraid. They're too modern, but certainly from the Second World War backwards. So in there you've got Field Marshal Montgomery, who was just a lieutenant general at the start. Also General Patton, George Patton. Eisenhower, great general. And also on the Russian side, people like Marshal Zhukov, Andrei Vasilevsky, fantastic field marshal. Vasilevsky, he was fantastic. Then, of course, the Germans had brilliant generals as well, Field Marshal Bodel, and a whole heap more. Obviously, you can go on and on about the German generals in World War II. And that, of course, is before you get to World War I, where you have a group of great German generals there as well. So there's plenty of people we can talk about in terms of the 20th century, even before you go back to other wars. And you can include civil wars. So General Lee et al. In the American Civil War. And of course, the British Civil War, the English Civil War, sorry, in the 17th century. Then you've got a whole host of other battles. John Churchill, who became the Duke of Marlborough, of course. In Europe, you've got the Duke of Wellington, Sir Arthur Wellesley. You've got Napoleon, who is well regarded by many people to be the best general in history. And then, of course, on the naval side, you have people like Horatio Nelson. And I think, without wishing to simplify things too much, I think effectively, whilst you can make a very good argument for Themistocles at the Battle of Salamis 2,500 years ago against the Persians, which was a brilliant naval move, either number one with Horatio Nelson or Horatio Nelson is number one on his own. Because while Francis Drake was a brilliant naval admiral, the reality is that the Spanish Armada back in 1588 was blown to pieces by the weather, not just fire ships. And Nelson was able to win again and again and again and again at sea. So I think in terms of the military side, let's deal with the naval first. It's impossible to do better than Lord Horatio Nelson. Admiral Nelson, he was the very finest in history, and he's head and shoulders above anyone else in military history. There's really no point in going into a big exegesis on that. I mean, you can learn a lot about Horatio Nelson, and they do a lot on the rest is history, but there's no one to beat him. No point. And when you take into account that he had one eye and one arm, and he just kept on going, and he died sort of making sure his men could see him, being at the front of the battle, it's Horatio Nelson, hands down. It's just that discussion is over. There's no debate. It's an ended discussion. Lord Horatio Nelson is number one on the high seas. So that's the naval side. On the military side, on the land side, well, that is a lot harder. Because, as I say, you can go from the Second World War back to the First World War and intervening skirmishes. And then you're back to the Napoleonic Wars and the Franco-Prussian Wars, Sebastopol, European conflagrations, then America, pre-Civil War, the American Civil War. So the 18th century had plenty of action in North America as well. And then you're back to the English Civil War, Cromwell et al., and the Cavaliers. And so very quickly, the list gets very, very large, right? So you're basically going from Andrei Vasilevsky, the Russian field marshal, who swept through all of China in 2 weeks, basically, and drove the Japanese out in the end of Second World War, okay, back all the way through European history and North American history as a result as well. And I suppose we can have a chat about the conquistadors in early European settlement and intervention, all the way back to the Norman conquests and the Vikings in general. The Normans were Vikings, but they were the second wave of Vikings, and they were better in every way after 1066 and after than the earlier Vikings, who were raiders, all the way back to the Eastern Roman Empire and Justinian the Great and Belisarius, his general. Obviously, you've got Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, 732 AD, grandfather of Charlemagne, who hammered the Moors out of France back to Spain. Okay, so he stopped the Islamic wave into Europe. And then, of course, as you go back in time, you hit the Western Roman Empire as well as the Eastern Roman Empire. And the Western Roman Empire hung on for a long time because it had some very clever generals. And then you're back into the Roman Empire proper, where you had brilliant generals who ended up in charge of the empire because they were brilliant generals. And that takes you all the way back through the 1st century BC, all the way back to, I think it was Scipio's nephew, who was at the Third Punic War at Carthage in 150 BC. Obviously, we've gone through Augustus, Julius Caesar, Marius, Sulla, that group, the military dictators in the 1st century BC, all the way back to the Scipios, who turned things around for Rome after the Battle of Cannae. I think that was 216 or 218 BC, where Hannibal destroyed the Roman army on 2 consecutive days, and there were 2 consuls. The first one died on the first day, the second one died on the second day. So that was a big turning point in military history because the Roman Republic died on that battlefield, and then the Romans decided to move to military competence, which had a massive change on the way they ran their city and country and political institutions, but it meant that they won and they survived. And self-preservation was the order of the day after Cannae in 200, whatever it was, BC, when Hannibal comprehensively destroyed the armies of the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic and its armies was destroyed that day, or those 2 days, and then Rome rose as effectively a military dictatorship after that, although some historians would disagree with that approach, but they are wrong, in my opinion. And then, of course, you're still going back through history, and there's some interesting people on the way back to Alexander, who was born in 356 BC, well regarded by many as the greatest general in history. He also fought in the front lines. And then, of course, his father, Philip of Macedon, who built the army that he had and really hardened veterans from Macedonia that Alexander was able to utilize in Persia and all the way to India and Pakistan and Afghanistan. He went so far. The spear won land of Philip of Macedon, Philip of Macedon's techniques. If you put Alexander as number 1, they're sort of handcuffed together because you've got Philip there as well, even though Philip never took over half the world, or most of the world, most of the known world. So you're back that far, and then going 1 century back to about the 5th century BC, that's where you have the Persian Wars, where you have Themistocles, Eurybiades, you have King Leonidas at Thermopylae, but also you've got the Peloponnesian Wars, and with great naval battles there and generals there as well. That turned out to be a bit of a mess, especially for the Athenians. Well, it wasn't great for the Persians either. And then you go back to the 6th century BC, and that's certainly not as celebrated. You've got the Etruscans in the Italian peninsula fighting with everyone, barbarians, their own people. Well, they're sort of client states, and Rome, of course, broke away in 509 BC from the Etruscan Federation. That's also part of history that's not well understood. The Romans were effectively the Latin Etruscans. They were just Etruscans. The notion that they were anything else is quite ridiculous. The Etruscans were prolific. And of course, the Etruscans lasted longer than the Roman Republic. And then you keep on going back through history to about 1000 BC, and you've got the Davidic dynasty. So you've got King David and his son, King Solomon, the wise. They were good fighters. Solomon was really good at diplomacy and international business as well. King Solomon, we can thank him for basically modernizing or starting the modernizing period with his management of the copper mines of Timnah. Moving all the way back, I mean, you've got Ramesses the Great, Ramesses the Second, but the Battle of Kadesh, his big famous one, that was indecisive at best. At worst, he lost that, but it created a fantastic peace treaty, which still hangs in the United Nations. The Hittites were very successful, but the Hittites under Shupalulima before that had won a battle and managed to capture a whole lot of slaves or prisoners who they made slaves who had the plague, and that almost wiped out the Hittites. So winning battles can be a disaster if you capture people who turn out to be very ill and they end up helping pass plague through your population. Trap for would-be megalomaniacs: if you win a battle, just make sure the people you conquer don't have the plague or you're in trouble. At that point, you basically go back to Thutmose III in the Middle Kingdom in the middle of the second millennia BC. He's considered the Napoleon of his age. He was very successful. And moving back even further to the third millennium BC, you've got Sargon the Great in Mesopotamia and his daughter Enheduanna, the priestess. But I'm not sure that really helps you a great deal, because ultimately, if we're talking about the greatest general, a military general in history, we're talking about a land warrior, and there's only half a dozen to a dozen who qualify. Now, some people have said that Field Marshal Vasilevsky, I can't remember if it's Andrei or Sergei Vasilevsky, the Soviet general, was the best, and he certainly managed to move the Japanese out of China. Alexander, in almost 2 weeks. Just astonishing what he managed with Colonel General Grelaw, I think, with the 5th Tactical Machine Division of the Soviet Army. And what they achieved, because the Japanese put up a fight in 44, 45, what he achieved was just astonishing. So you can make the argument that Vasilevsky has had the greatest win in a short period of time. You'd probably have to give him that. The only issue there is you'd have to give him equal billing, so equal gold medal with some of Alexander's victories and Caesar's victories, and Hannibal as well, and even Field Marshal Montgomery, because there was some spectacular land victories throughout history. I mean, absolutely spectacular that we can't ignore. And I don't think it helps to do anything but a draw in certain cases. So we're talking about single land victories. Then you'd have a whole group of them on the dais holding number one position, holding the gold medal, with definitely Vasilevsky in there for moving the Japanese out of China in a few weeks at the end of World War II. You'd have to put King Leonidas up there for holding back the Persian army at Thermopylae in 480 BC in the Persian Wars with his 300 Spartans. He had plenty of other Greeks with him as well, but they held up Xerxes and his 250,000 there. That meant that the Persian navy got wrecked before it even met up with Themistocles at the Battle of Salamis. And it left negative portent all over the Persian army. And they felt after Thermopylae they were going to lose. And Xerxes actually went home. A lot of them actually went home. And then the 150,000 that did turn up to the Battle of Plataea ultimately got defeated by the unified Greeks. And as I recall, cavalry started into battle on the last day, the Persian cavalry, and then instead of connecting with the enemy, they actually turned around and rode away. It was a debacle. Plataea was a debacle, ultimately, when they joined battle after a week or so. and the ancient Greeks cleaned them up, and that was that. So you'd have to put King Leonidas up there with Alexander Vasilevsky, and then in there you've got Montgomery's left hook at El Alamein and also El Alam Halfa. In advance of that, there was some great stuff in the desert. Very talented General Bernard Montgomery. But then, obviously, you've got Napoleon in there as well with the Battle of Austerlitz, which, of course, was Napoleon's favorite as well, because he got the unified armies there to commit to the battle and attack him. And only once he'd achieved that, he then had his reserve force that then counterpunched them. And that was the end of that, because he'd got them to commit fully to the battle. So you'd have to put Austerlitz and Napoleon in pole position for the greatest land victory as well, with Leonidas and Vasilevsky. You'd put Robert the Bruce in there as well for Bannockburn. That was brilliant land victory by Robert the Bruce against Edward II in terms of preparation, so on and so forth. They also had a late group of people that came to the battle that frightened Edward II's forces. So you'd have to put Robert the Bruce and Bannockburn in there as well in terms of great land victories. So Robert the Bruce gets a gong as well for Scotland. In relation to other land victories going back in time, I think it's fair enough to leave the civil wars out, because they were not great victories, and they were very sad, in many cases non-professional armies. So out of there, I think I will pull the civil wars in England, America, and also the American War of Independence, because they were a different type of beast. They were also a bit of a mess. Some of you may be aware of a man by the name of Lafayette, a Frenchman who helped the Americans in the American War of Independence. He was actually radicalized by the Duke of Gloucester, who was the king's brother. It's all very odd, the American War of Independence, because a lot of English supported the rebels and thought the whole thing was ridiculous. And you had a mad king there. I'm afraid to say that you've got to pull the civil wars out in the American War of Independence. You can't give any of those the number one general spot. So Lee, Washington, Cromwell, all of those people, they're out. Sorry, but that's just the way it is. They're out. Their papers are unmarked. They don't get a gong. Moving back into the 16th century, obviously you got Drake on water. I mean, before him, obviously, further in time, you got the European adventures with the Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, but he doesn't make it to the top as number one general in history. His achievements do not rate as highly as the ones we're talking about from Napoleon, Leonidas, Vasilevsky, that sort. So moving back through medieval history, you certainly had some very interesting, talented generals, some great scrapes. But the next time we run into a great general, you'd have to say it would be Henry V, son of Henry IV, son of John of Lancaster, who was one of the sons of Edward III. And he won the great battle at Agincourt and forced the Treaty of Troyes. And that basically gave the English king the French crown as well. Now, it didn't last very long, obviously, just a couple of years, but at that point, Britain and France, the English won. Now, they couldn't sustain the victory, and it just started up again, and then you had Joan of Arc, and 30 years later, and you had Edward IV effectively ending the 100 Years' War by getting the French to agree to hand over 200,000 gold pounds. The French only handed over a portion of that, but it was a great deal of money, and effectively the English won the 100 Years' War. Just an important note, though, if you ask the French, they will say the opposite. They'll say they didn't pay it all and that they won the 100 Years' War. Fair enough, you can call it a draw if you want, but at the end of the day, Edward IV, my ancestor, he was a Mortimer like me, he got a substantial amount of money, even as far as kings go, out of the French, because he had the Duke of Burgundy helping him, and the French basically were forced to sign a piece of paper and pay for the English to go away. So that was the 100 Years' War, but Edward IV doesn't make it into the top generals. Edward III definitely does. Edward III, who would have been called Edward the Great if it died earlier, certainly makes it up there because he had Cressy, Poitiers. I mean, he had fantastic victories in Scotland. The Scots couldn't believe it. Edward III fought in the front line often, as did his son, the Black Prince. Edward III was a brilliant, brilliant king and would have had the word great after his name, like Alfred the Great, of course. But the end of his kingship was marred by difficulties. Let's put it that way, difficulties. But you've got to put Cressy and Poitiers up there as brilliant land victories. He had some great naval victories as well, but his land victories were up there with Napoleon's and Vasilevsky's. Different sort of fights, medieval fights and knights and that sort of thing, but still very dramatic, very daring, very brilliant. And the point is, he could carry an army with him. They would fight with him through anything. And that, to some extent, is what defines a great general. If you can carry the whole army with you and you've got that personality. And all the people we're talking about, Vasilevsky, Leonidas, Napoleon, Edward III, Henry V, Themistocles, they all had that, the it factor to carry it through. But Edward III is definitely up there for land victories and contention as the greatest general ever. The French at this point, unfortunately, haven't had a lot. They've only had Napoleon. They've certainly had some great generals, but they don't qualify as the greatest. So the French are very good at having great generals and great warriors, but not the greatest of them all. Right? And that's even allowing for my bias. So moving backwards in time even further, obviously you got Edward I. He blotted his own copybook. He was rather brutal, bad, certainly brave, but he was struggling with the end of a very concentrated feudalism, and he was fighting the Scots too much as well. I'm afraid he don't make it. He was a good general, but not a great one, and certainly not the greatest. And his father, Henry III, you wouldn't put on any military book. Of course, their great foe, the Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort, he was brilliant and gave us the Parliament, Simon Says. So in some ways, Simon Says is up there for the greatest general because we still have Simon Says because of Simon de Montfort. And we have the Parliament because of him. So he was a great general, potentially the greatest, but he was there for political reasons only. He didn't really mind which way the army wheeled around or which way it went. He was there to win political victories, and he did. He gave us Parliament and Simon Says, and that's that. So give him credit for that. Moving forward, or backwards, I should say, in time, that's the 13th century. Moving back to the 12th century, we had Henry II, Henry Plantagenet, the son of Henry Fitz-Empress. So he was the Duke, ultimately Duke of Normandy, but also the Duke of Anjou. And he won many victories, but you'd have to say probably his son, Richard the Lionheart, was a greater general. His attack of the Holy Land, when he went over there, was astonishing, jumping off boats on horseback and leading 2,000 Italian Marines into Acre and taking that back. Very talented general. So Richard the Lionheart is definitely up there. Son of Henry II, with their great victories, that's Richard the Lionheart's rather than his father, Henry II of England. And then, of course, moving backwards, you've got the Norman invasion and the Vikings, and you'd have to put William the Conqueror up there because he gets that title because of his success at the Battle of Hastings. And before that in England, you've got Alfred the Great. Moving backwards through Europe, of course, you've got Charlemagne and then his grandfather, Charles Martel, who were very successful generals of the Frankish Empire. And they're certainly up there with their achievement. Moving backwards from there, of course, we've got Justinian the Great and Belisarius, who in the 6th century AD were trying to re-establish the Roman Empire in the east and in the west. But they were stopped by 3 volcanoes going off in about a 10-year 12-year period, and that helped create the Dark Ages, and that was very dark. That was very unpleasant, especially for the Vikings who came out of that a couple of hundred years later, very hungry and angry and murderous and rampaging. So Justinian the Great's time was marred by that, and riots in Constantinople and political problems with tax collection and a whole range of other things. As a result, he just sort of sat there and reformed Roman law and built Hagia Sophia and San Vitale, the church in Ravenna in Italy, and did that sort of thing. And so he wasn't able to become a great military general. Military success as a result. Moving back in time, there's plenty of people you can talk about, but there's no real point in saying much until you get to the 1st century BC, going back in time, where you have an interesting line from Augustus or Octavian, his adopted uncle, who was Julius Caesar, and then Julius Caesar's uncle by marriage, who was Marius. So you got this sort of uncle, nephew, uncle group of people who ran Rome for a very long time, although Sulla and Pompey and Crassus were heavily involved as well. So it's really difficult to untangle Caesar, who was brilliant, especially in Gaul, very bloody, but very brilliant. Difficult to untangle Julius Caesar from Pompey Magnus, his friend, and even Crassus, who put down the Spartacus revolt. Very difficult to untangle them, right? And then you've got Marius and Sulla sitting there around, 105 to 85 BC, over a 20-year period. So, how do you untangle those fellows from each other? It's tough. It's tough. And then you've got to throw in, the Scipios and the Punic Wars as well. So you've got sort of 220 years of Roman generals precipitated by the fact that when they lost the Battle of Cannae against Hannibal, basically 216 BC, so the Battle of Cannae, however you want to put it, and Hannibal winning there precipitated 200 years of great Roman generals, because the Roman Republic died on those 2 days. The army died and the consuls died. So they had to move to military dictators. Now, they tried to shave the power of the dictators and even killed them and did all sorts of things, but it didn't change the fact that it became a non-republic. It became Rome the Great, and then finally Rome the Empire, as it utilized military dictators to win their wars for them, because it's better to have a military dictator and survive than keep your republic and not survive, because everyone's waving around their republican paperwork. So very difficult to disentangle them. And then you could spend hours, days, weeks, months, years talking about the Roman victories, Caesar's victories in Gaul. You could talk about Hannibal's victories in Spain and France, as well as in Italy, the big ones in Italy. He had 3 in a row, including Cannae. So it's sort of tricky. But they're all up there as being on the podium of having great military history, great military victories, including Pompey Magnus, who got rid of the pirates. Of course, they had 100 years of piracy on the Mediterranean because they got rid of the Carthaginians in 150 BC. So, of course, you had 100 years of the pirates running rampant because the Carthaginian navy was gone. So, one of the lesser-known results of getting rid of the Carthaginians and not having a proper functioning republic. He made silly mistakes, and then Pompey Magnus has to go and clean it up, which, of course, he did. But he doesn't get much credit for it because he was so bloodthirsty. Obviously, Alexander the Great stands out for being able to win almost anywhere against his own people, against his own family, his neighbors to the north, the rest of the Greeks to the south, and then against the Persians, Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela. He became Pharaoh of Egypt. The list goes on with Alex. It's very hard to not have him. Well, it's impossible not to have him on the podium as the greatest general in history. So ultimately, you'd have to put him as joint number 1, the greatest general in history, along with anyone else who makes it, because he also fought in the front line. So basically, as we're looking at it, you've got Alexander the Great as the greatest general in history. In equal standing with him is Edward III of England, who fought in the front line and just had victory after victory after victory after victory after victory as well, and who set things up for Agincourt as well and really helped drive European history. And then moving backwards in time, you have Leonidas, who had one victory, but a great victory. So you'd have to put him in there as well. And then obviously you've got Egyptian successors, but they're slightly different in that no one had much of a chance against the Egyptians because they had the Nile backing them and a massive empire, not just agricultural, but mining, gold as well. In terms of Asia and China, you've got many great warriors. So they are resplendent with great warriors. I'm not sure about great generals. Obviously, Sun Tzu. You could say almost Confucius was a great general because he was able to stop wars with words, literally. So Confucius was very talented, but it's more a Western Hemisphere thing that we're talking about here rather than in Asia, where they more had great warriors. All right. Great warriors from the samurai to in Japan to China, Korea, and the rest of Asia. And then with South America also, they had the conquistadors, but it's a different sort of concept. So we're left with Alexander and Edward III, and Napoleon, who had multiple victories over many decades. That's them. And they stand out. Multiple decades, multiple victories, multiple countries, very difficult circumstances. Can you call them apart? You put one up, Alexander or the Great or Edward III or Napoleon. I think you have to drop Napoleon off because even though he had very difficult circumstances surrounding him, he was ultimately deposed and significantly defeated. So that leaves you between Alexander the Great and Edward III. That's where it becomes very tough because Alexander the Great had a great father in Philip of Macedon. Edward III did not have a great father in the form of Edward II, and it would appear that Edward II was not killed by Roger Mortimer, my relative. He was actually just smuggled away and lived in a castle in luxury. So you're left, I think ultimately you have to go with Edward III of England because he had magnificent victories and he fought through the Black Death of 1347 to 49. And then he died in his own bed, and his victories helped set up Henry IV to have massive wins in France as well. So ultimately, it's got to be Edward III as the greatest general in history. But in terms of the greatest land victories, you'd have at least a dozen great land victories in there. And all of those people are great generals. This is for the greatest general ever. It's Edward III. The great generals, are plenty of those, plenty of greatest land victories, one-off land victories, in which Edward III's got a few as well. And in terms of great warriors, that's where Asia is far more well represented in great warriors. And a lot of that's to do with their technology, from martial arts to swordsmanship. That's why they had great warriors in Asia. That's what they focused on, right? Martial arts and great weapons. Anyway, hope that helps. Tell me what you think. Thanks.